Judge Whitaker slammed his gavel and told veteran Marcus Hill to take off his medal, the one he carried as a reminder of brothers lost in war. Marcus froze, torn between obeying and holding on to his dignity. Then the doors opened, and a military general walked into the courtroom. What could his presence mean, and how would it change everything? If this moment stirs something in you, go ahead and like and share this story. Let's step into what happened next. The morning heat pressed down like a heavy blanket, the kind that clung to your skin and made the air itself feel tense. Outside the county courthouse, a modest brick building with narrow windows, the crowd had already gathered. Reporters clustered near the steps, their cameras flashing like restless lightning. Every snap carried the weight of anticipation, as if everyone there knew something bigger than a routine hearing was about to unfold. Through the sea of bodies came Marcus Hill. He wasn't the kind of man who blended into the background, though he often wished he could. A tall black veteran in his early 50s, his frame was still broad from years of discipline, but his limp betrayed wounds that never truly healed. He moved slowly, leaning into the ache of an old injury, his dark suit worn at the cuffs and shoulders. Yet what caught every eye was the small silver medal pinned firmly to his chest. It wasn't just metal and ribbon. It was a story of sacrifice of men who never made it home. The questions came fast, a wall of voices pushing at him. "Mr. Hill, any comments before you go in? Do you think the court will treat you fairly?" One young reporter shoved a microphone closer, his voice sharp. "Why wear the medal today?" Trying to make a statement. Marcus didn't answer. He never did when the questions cut too close. Instead, his hand rose almost instinctively, fingertips brushing against the medal, holding it in place, as if it might slip away under the weight of so many eyes. His jaw tightened, and he pushed through the courthouse doors without a word. Inside, the atmosphere wasn't kinder. The courtroom was already packed, rows of wooden benches filled with townspeople, reporters scribbling notes, officers stationed near the walls. The air carried that electric murmur of whispered judgments. "Keeps flaunting it," one man muttered. "Why bring a war medal into a courtroom?" Another whispered, shaking his head. Some looked at Marcus with pity, others with open contempt. It was the kind of silence that wasn't really silent at all. It was the silence of people waiting for you to trip so they could say they saw it coming. Marcus moved to the defendant's table and lowered himself into the chair, with careful precision, his limp making even that small act a quiet struggle. He kept his eyes forward, but he could feel the weight of their stares pressing against his back. Then the double doors creaked open again, and Judge Harold Whitaker entered. A tall, stern-faced white man in his 60s, Whitaker carried himself with the cold authority of someone used to being obeyed without question. His robe seemed to add inches to his frame, and his sharp gaze swept across the room like a searchlight. The moment his eyes landed on Marcus's chest, his expression tightened. His jaw set, his nostrils flared. It was subtle but unmistakable displeasure. The medal offended him. The room hushed as Whitaker took his seat, but beneath the stillness lay an undercurrent of anticipation, like the faint hum before a storm breaks. Not far from the press row, a young journalist leaned closer to his colleague and whispered, "You hear the rumor. Word is a high-ranking officer might show up today. Somebody important." The other reporter raised his brows. "Here, why would a general waste time on a hearing like this?" "Exactly," the young one replied. "Which makes me think it's true. Nobody would spread it if it wasn't." The whisper was quick, almost drowned out by the shuffle of papers and the clearing of throats, but it planted a seed. Somewhere beyond those walls, someone powerful might be walking toward this courtroom, even now. Up front, Marcus adjusted his tie, steadying himself. He wasn't a man easily rattled, not after everything he had seen in combat. But this wasn't a battlefield he recognized. Here, dignity wasn't protected by a uniform or rank. Here, it was something you had to fight for all over again, word by word, look by look. Judge Whittaker leaned forward, his gavel tapping once against the block, not hard, but sharp enough to cut through the whispers. This court will come to order. His voice carried the crisp edge of command, one that left no room for warmth. And in that charged silence, you could almost feel the lines being drawn. On one side sat Marcus Hill, his medal catching the light, as if defying the shadows that pressed against him. On the other sat Judge Whittaker, authority carved into every line of his face. It wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a collision waiting to happen between a man's honor and the cold machinery of power. The crowd leaned in breath held as though they knew before this day was over, something would break. The gavel slammed sharp and merciless, cutting through the courtroom like a blade. Judge Whittaker's voice followed cold and commanding. "This is a court of law, Mr. Hill, not a stage for theatrics. Remove that medal. Now." A hush fell. It wasn't silence. It was pressure. The kind that pressed down on every chest in the room. All eyes swung toward Marcus. Marcus's fingers twitched, drawn to the silver medal on his chest. He touched it gently, almost protectively. The metal was cool, but the memories it carried were searing hot. In a blink, he wasn't in that courtroom anymore. He was in the smoke and dirt of the battlefield. Gunfire cracked in the distance, men shouted orders, and the ground shook with explosions. He remembered dragging Corporal Jameson by the shoulders, blood soaking through his uniform, whispering, "Hold on, brother. Just hold on." He remembered the deafening silence after the blast and the faces that never rose again. His shoulders trembled now, not from weakness, but from the ghosts clawing at him. His eyes blurred, the weight of memory pulling tears to the surface. Mr. Hill, Judge Whittaker barked, his gavel pounding again. "Did you hear me? Take it off." Across the room, Ellen Brooks, the prosecutor, leaned forward with a cruel smirk. Her words dripped with disdain. "Oh, look at him," she sneered, a man hiding behind his past, begging for sympathy. A ripple of laughter trickled through the benches. Low, sharp, poisonous. Someone muttered, "Hero act's not going to save him." Another voice snickered, "Just a washed-up soldier." The sound pierced Marcus deeper than shrapnel ever had. Slowly he raised his chin. His lips moved, the words almost swallowed by the air, but clear enough for those nearby to hear, "It isn't mine." His voice cracked, but steadied strong in its quiet. "It belongs to them, to the ones who didn't come home." The laughter faltered. Even some of those who had joined in shifted uncomfortably, as if shame had caught them by the throat. But Whittaker's face hardened further, his authority bristling at Marcus's defiance. "This is not a memorial, Mr. Hill. This is my courtroom. Obey, or I will hold you in contempt." Marcus's hand stayed firm on the medal. His silence screamed louder than words. From the corner, a reporter whispered to another god, "He's not defying the law. He's protecting something bigger." Cameras clicked again, sensing history unfolding. And in that suspended moment, the room split in two. Those who saw only a judge enforcing order, and those who saw a veteran's dignity being stripped with a single command. Marcus didn't move. His chest rose and fell slowly. His jaw clenched. And though he said nothing more, the message was unmistakable. "You can order me to take it off, but you cannot order me to forget what it stands for." The medal still hung at Marcus's chest, catching a pale glint from the overhead lights. His hand brushed it once more, not to flaunt it, but as if the cold metal steadied his pulse. The prosecutor, Elaine Brooks, seized on the gesture like a hawk spotting prey. "So that's your proof," she sneered, pacing closer to the stand. "A piece of tin and a story nobody can verify." Her words sliced through the hushed courtroom. Judge Whittaker leaned forward, chin resting in his palm, eyes narrowing. "Mr. Hill, the prosecutor asked you for evidence. Do you have admissible proof? Documents? Witnesses? Anything tangible?" Marcus drew a slow breath. His voice came out steady, though the weight behind it pressed against his ribs. "The proof doesn't fit in a folder. It lives in the nights I can't sleep, in the names I carry." Brooks let out a sharp laugh, dripping with triumph. "So, that's a no." His gaze cut back to her. "It's the kind of proof you hear when the shooting stops, when all you have left is someone else's silence." Non-responsive, Brooks snapped. "Let the record reflect the defendant refuses to answer directly." The judge tapped his gavel once, irritation edging into the sound. "Counsel, move on." Marcus's hand dropped from the metal. The room seemed to shrink. He chose not to argue, not to trade memory for spectacle. His quiet wasn't surrender. It was the last scrap of respect he could offer to the men who never made it home. Brooks, sensing the momentum swing in her favor, pressed harder. She tilted her head, voice curling into mock sympathy. "What's the matter, Mr. Hill? Cat got your tongue? Or maybe the truth finally caught up with you." He said nothing. The silence stretched taut as wire. A chair creaked. Someone coughed and was shushed. The court reporter's keys clicked like distant rain. Two jurors exchanged a glance that said more than words, "He's dodging." In the second row, a teenager raised his phone to record until a bailiff's stare froze the screen. Near the aisle, an older man with a flag pin whispered, "Give him a minute," but his wife squeezed his hand, her eyes warning him to stay quiet. The murmurs thickened, doubt, curiosity, a small mean thrill. It doesn't take much for a room to make up its mind. Sometimes it only takes one man staying quiet, long enough for everyone else to speak for him. Brooks seized the moment. She angled toward the jury, her voice sharp with finality. "Exactly what I thought. A man hiding behind stories." Marcus felt the words strike like a boot to the chest. In his mind, he spoke to the men who weren't there. "I won't sell your names to this room. I won't let them dissect your deaths like exhibits." He inhaled, fighting the shake in his hands. "If I speak, I'll speak wrong. If I stay quiet, they'll call it guilt." His eyes lifted toward the jury, then to the bench. Judge Whittaker's expression was a locked door, unreadable and cold. So he let the silence stand, not because he had nothing to say, but because the truth that mattered didn't belong to him alone. He thought of a helmet half buried in dirt, a photo folded inside a letter that would never be read. He thought of the promise he had made. "If I make it home, I won't let the noise swallow what you were." From the back row, a woman leaned forward, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "Don't you see? He's honoring the dead." A few heads turned, but her words drowned beneath the scrape of benches and the shuffle of notes. The bailiff took one slow step down the aisle, not toward Marcus, but toward the murmurs, and the noise wilted into silence again. At counsel table, Brooks slid a new file across like a blade hungry for the next strike. On the bench, Judge Whittaker angled the gavel in his palm as though weighing it. He didn't swing, he didn't need to. The threat lived in the pause, and in that pause, the whole room seemed to tilt against Marcus. People decided things about him, about his mettle, about what silence meant. Brooks saw the shift and smiled with her eyes. She was about to press harder to dig into the battlefield he carried inside him because she could smell blood in the water. And Marcus knew it. The silence he had chosen to protect others was now the very silence that would drag him back to a place he had buried deep. Brooks wasn't finished. She leaned into the silence like a blade pressing deeper. Her voice rang sharp, almost cruel in its precision. Or maybe she said slowly, "Your silence is not about honor at all. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe those men you talk about, those who didn't make it home, didn't make it because of you." The words hit harder than any gavel. The air in the courtroom thickened, every ear straining. Marcus's jaw tightened, but his hands betrayed him, curling against the wood rail as if bracing for impact. "You were there," Brooks pushed on, circling him like a predator. "Men died under your command. Isn't it true, Mr. Hill, that some of them might still be alive if you had made better choices?" The question tore open a door Marcus had locked years ago. He tried to steady his breath, but memory didn't ask permission. It crashed in. He was no longer in the courtroom. The walls dissolved into smoke and fire. He smelled it, first the sting of burning diesel, the metallic tang of blood. The heat pressed against his skin, sand turned molten underfoot. He could hear the rattle of gunfire, sharp and relentless, and above it all, the voice. Corman. Over here." He remembered running boots slipping, heart pounding against his ribs like a drum. The sky was torn by tracers. Men screamed. The world had become sound and dust and red. Then he saw him, David, his closest friend, sprawled against the sandbag wall, blood soaking his uniform. Marcus dropped beside him, hands shaking, pressing down, whispering, "Stay with me. I've got you. Just hold on." But David's eyes, once alive with mischief and dreams of home, began to dim. The gunfire faded into a hollow roar. Marcus held him tighter, as if arms alone could stop death. His palm came away slick with blood. And then there was silence, deeper than any courtroom hush, broken only by Marcus's ragged breathing and the dull thud of his own heart. The memory yanked him back to the present. His chest rose and fell, too quickly, his throat tight. He gripped the rail like it was the only thing keeping him upright. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked, not from weakness, but from carrying too much. "That medal." His fingers touched it gently, reverently. "It isn't mine. It belongs to the men who never came back. To David. To so many names you'll never know." The room went still. Even the prosecutor hesitated, her words caught behind clenched teeth. A muffled sob escaped from the gallery. A woman dabbed her eyes with a crumpled tissue. Beside her, a young man swallowed hard, blinking fast, as if embarrassed by his own tears. Marcus's gaze swept across the faces. "You want to call it guilt? Maybe it is. Every night I close my eyes, I wonder if I could have done more. But don't you dare think it means I dishonor them. Every breath I take, every step I walk free, is because they gave theirs." For a moment, the courtroom wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a sanctuary of grief, the raw kind that doesn't ask for judgment, only witness. But Judge Whitaker's gavel slammed down like a gunshot, shattering the spell. "Enough!" His voice boomed, brittle and unyielding. "This is not a memorial service. This is a court of law, and in this room I decide what counts as truth." The sound echoed harsh against the walls. Whitaker's face stayed stone unmoved by the tears gathering around him. His eyes didn't waver, not even as a juror wiped her cheek with the back of her hand, Not even as a man in the back row lowered his head to hide the tremor in his shoulders. The contrast was brutal on one side, quiet sobs, hands clasping together in shared sorrow. On the other, a judge who wielded authority like a shield against feeling. Marcus stood caught between the two worlds' haunted memory on one side, cold justice on the other. His silence had been twisted into guilt, his pain sharpened into a weapon against him. But still he held the metal fingers steady now, and though his voice had faltered, the truth lingered in the air, undeniable. The weight he carried was not shame, it was sacrifice. And everyone in that room knew it, even if the judge refused to let it show. For the first time that day, Marcus lowered his head. His shoulders, broad and scarred by years of service, seemed smaller somehow, as if the weight, pressing down on him, had finally won. His hand trembled as it reached for the medal that hung against his chest. The sound of the clasp unfastening was faint, but in that silence it was deafening. I could see his lips move, though his voice never carried beyond a whisper. Maybe it's time. Maybe I can't carry this anymore. Maybe quitting is the only way out. His fingers fumbled with the ribbon, slow, unsteady. It wasn't just a medal he was removing. It was years of blood sacrifice and the last anchor to the men who never made it back. And in that moment, Marcus Hill, the man who had stood unbroken in deserts, jungles, and battlefields, looked ready to surrender in the one place he shouldn't. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Brooks straightened, sensing victory, her eyes narrowing like a hawk closing in. Judge Whitaker leaned back in his chair, satisfied, his gavel resting loosely in his hand, as if he could already taste the order he was about to give. But then something shifted. Marcus's eyes, clouded with defeat, flickered past the railing, past the attorneys, past the cold stare of the judge, and landed on the back row. There, sitting small among the towering adults, was his son. 12 years old, legs barely reaching the floor, his hands clasped together, tight in front of his chest. Not fidgeting, not distracted like most children would be in such a room. He sat still, eyes fixed on his father, with a look that could only be described as prayer. I swear you could see Marcus freeze mid-motion. His hand, halfway to pulling the medal free, stopped. The boy's lips moved silently, but the message was clear. Don't give up, Dad. Please, don't give up. And just like that, the battlefield returned, not in smoke and gunfire, this time, but in hope. Marcus's eyes filled the tears breaking loose, as though years of locked-away grief had been cracked open by that single childlike plea. His hand closed tighter around the metal fingers, white at the knuckles. He didn't let it go. He couldn't. When he lifted his head again, he was not the same man who had bowed it a moment earlier. His voice came rough, broken at first, but it carried. If you want it, he rasped, staring at the bench, then you'll have to take it from me. With your own hands. The words hit like thunder. They weren't shouted, but they carried a power louder than any gavel. It wasn't just defiance. It was the sound of a man reclaiming himself. The gallery erupted into murmurs. A wave of voices spilling through the chamber. Some gasped. Some clapped hands to their mouths. Others whispered fiercely to their neighbors. Even those who hadn't known Marcus before this day leaned forward, drawn by the fire suddenly burning in him. Brooks's face flushed with anger. She shot up from her chair, her finger stabbing the air as if she could puncture his resolve. Your Honor, this is outrageous. He is defying the authority of this court. Judge Whitaker slammed his gavel. Once, twice, again, the sharp cracks ricocheted against the marble walls. Order! I will have order in this courtroom!" His voice thundered, but the sound was almost swallowed by the stir of the crowd. Still, Marcus did not flinch. He stood there, metal clutched to his chest, shoulders squared, his gaze steady as stone. The boy in the back row straightened too, as though mirroring his father, their eyes locked across the chaos. And right then, everyone knew something had changed. This was no longer a broken soldier crushed under the weight of memory. This was a man who had chosen to stand. His silence might have been twisted as guilt before, but now his defiance spoke louder than any speech. It was the first crack in the armor of the court, the first flicker of resistance against the cold machinery of judgment. Marcus Hill had bowed his head, but he would not bow again. Judge Whitaker's patience finally cracked. He slammed his gavel so hard it echoed through the chamber like a rifle shot. His face, pale with fury, flushed crimson. Contempt of court, he bellowed, his voice shaking the rafters. "You will be held in custody immediately." The command tore through the room, but Marcus didn't move. He didn't flinch, didn't lower his eyes. He stood tall, his chest rising and falling, the metal still clutched tight. His gaze, steady and unwavering, seemed to burn brighter with every second. It wasn't the look of a man bracing for chains. It was the look of a man who had nothing left to fear. Whitaker leaned forward, certain that his words had crushed him. Brooks smirked, her lips curling in triumph as she whispered to the attorneys beside her. She thought it was over. To her, Marcus was just another stubborn defendant about to be dragged away in disgrace. But then something happened that none of them expected. It started with one voice. A man in the gallery, his gray hair tucked beneath a faded cap, rose to his feet. His voice cracked, but carried sharp and strong in the silence. "Respect our veteran." Every head turned. The sound wasn't much, just a single call, but it was like striking a match in a room filled with gasoline. Another stood, then another. Their voices rose, layering over one another, until the chamber shook with a chorus. "Respect our veteran! Respect our veteran!" The chant swelled, echoing off the marble walls, drowning out even the judge's pounding gavel. Whitaker shouted for order, Brooks barked at the bailiffs to silence the crowd. But the chant only grew louder. I remember glancing toward the doors. That was when I realized it wasn't just inside the courtroom. Outside, through the tall windows, you could hear the rumble of voices, hundreds of them. A crowd had gathered on the courthouse steps, men and women carrying worn flags, holding signs that read, "Respect Veterans." They had come quietly at first, waiting, hoping. But now word had spread, and the chant inside was pouring out like fire to the crowd beyond. Then the cameras arrived. Local news crews swung their lenses, broadcasting the moment live. Microphones caught every chant, every echo. Across the city, living rooms and diners were suddenly filled with the sight of ordinary citizens standing shoulder to shoulder for one man, Marcus Hill. And through it all, Marcus remained silent. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move his hands. He stood rooted, as steady as a monument, letting the weight of the crowd's cry speak for him. His silence was no longer surrender. It was dignity. It was defiance. Even from where I sat, you could feel it. That silence wasn't empty. It carried centuries of sacrifice, the voices of those who never came home, the pride of a man who would not bow even when the law tried to break him. Brooks's smirk faltered. She glanced nervously toward the gallery, then toward the cameras outside. This wasn't the picture she wanted, the decorated veteran standing proud while the people rallied behind him. For the first time, she realized she might be losing control. Whitaker pounded his gavel again, his voice hoarse. "Order! I demand order!" But the word order had lost its power. It was swallowed by the chant that rolled like thunder. Respect our veteran! Respect our veteran! The bailiffs shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between the bench and the growing unrest. They weren't sure who to obey anymore, the judge barking commands or the crowd demanding justice. Marcus never said a word. He didn't need to. His silence became the voice of every man and woman shouting for him, a steady flame fed by the fire spreading around him. The air in that courtroom was electric. You could feel the shift the moment when one man's quiet refusal to bow became more than defiance. It became a movement, and in that instant, everyone in that room understood the trial was no longer about one man. It was about something larger, something burning, something unstoppable. Marcus Hill stood at the center of it all, not defeated, not silenced, but aflame. The chanting still echoed faintly when Brooks leaned forward, her voice slicing through the charged air like a blade. "If you're truly worthy," she sneered, her tone sharp and unforgiving, "then prove it. Show us something real." It was a taunt meant to corner Marcus into silence. For a heartbeat, I thought he would stay still, let the storm of voices outside speak for him. But slowly, with hands that trembled more from memory than from fear, Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. When he pulled his hand back, he wasn't holding a weapon or evidence from some sealed file. It was just a piece of paper creased yellowed and nearly torn at the folds. The room seemed to lean closer as he opened it carefully, as though the very weight of time might cause it to crumble. His voice, low and rough, broke the silence. "If I don't make it back," he began, the words shaking in the air, "keep this letter as proof that you fought for all of us, not just yourself." The handwriting was jagged, the ink faded. At the bottom was a signature. A name, a name that was no longer among the living. It was the letter of a fallen brother in arms. The moment he spoke those words, the courtroom froze. The bailiffs stopped shifting. The reporters lowered their cameras. Even Whitaker's gavel hovered in the air, unmoving. I could hear someone behind me stifle a sob. Another drew a shaky breath. The letter wasn't just paper. It carried the weight of blood spilled on foreign soil, of promises made in mud and smoke, of young men who never got to come home. For a moment, the courtroom wasn't a courtroom at all. It was a battlefield cemetery, and Marcus was standing among the ghosts. But Brooks refused to yield. She snapped her voice like a whip, cutting into that fragile silence. A wrinkled scrap of paper, she scoffed. Anyone could fake that. Stories are easy to invent. The cruelty of it hung in the air. The spell shattered. And then Whitaker, his expression cold as stone, delivered the blow. "This court is not swayed by sentiment," he said firmly. "This is a court of law, not a theater for feelings." The words felt heavy, final. They landed like a verdict before the trial had even ended. Marcus lowered the paper slowly, his hand trembling not from weakness but from the fury he contained. He closed his fist around the metal that rested in his palm, gripping it until the chain bit into his skin. Then, in a voice so quiet it forced everyone to lean in, he whispered, "How much blood would be enough for you?" The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They rolled through the chamber like distant thunder, low and unstoppable. For a second it was as though time itself stopped to listen. The question wasn't just for Whitaker or for Brooks. It was for every person in that room, for every spectator outside watching on the screens. The silence that followed was deafening. I saw people shiver, their eyes glassy, their throats tightening with emotion. Even the reporters, usually quick to scribble or whisper, simply froze. The letter in Marcus's hand seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights, a fragile relic holding the truth of sacrifice. Outside, the chants that had begun earlier faded into a hush, as though the crowd could feel the weight of his words through the walls. And then, like a single wave, breaking the murmur, spread people whispering, clutching their flags, tighter eyes wet with tears. Marcus didn't lift his head in triumph. He didn't grandstand. He just stood there holding a medal and a letter, two fragile proofs of lives risked and lives lost. And though the judge had tried to strip it of meaning, though Brooks had tried to sneer it away, everyone knew no law, no gavel, no insult could erase what that letter represented. That whisper, that single question, would hang in the air long after the trial was over. How much blood is ever enough? The air in the courtroom was so still, it felt like the entire room was holding its breath. Judge Whittaker straightened his back, his lips pressed into a thin line. He lifted the gavel, slow and deliberate, his face a mask of finality. You could almost hear the words forming before he even spoke them. This court will now, and then it happened. The heavy oak doors at the back of the chamber burst open with a force that made everyone flinch. The sound slammed against the walls like a gunshot. Heads turned. Conversations died. Standing in the doorway was a figure that seemed to fill the room before he even took a step. General Robert Stanton. Even if you didn't know his name, you would have known by the way he carried himself. The sharp crease of his uniform, the weight of the medals that glinted under the lights, the steady, unyielding eyes of a man who had seen war and walked back through it alive. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then, as though pulled by an invisible thread, people rose from their seats. First one row, then another, until the entire courtroom was standing. It wasn't planned. It wasn't ordered. It was instinct. Respect demanded it. I felt my own legs pushing me upward before I realized what I was doing. General Stanton walked down the aisle with the measured pace of a man who knew exactly where he was going and why. Each step echoed against the tile floor, a rhythm that drowned out the gavel still frozen in Whittaker's raised hand. He didn't stop until he stood just a few feet from Marcus. For the first time in the trial, Marcus looked less like a defendant, and more like what he had always been, a soldier among soldiers, a brother among brothers. The general's voice filled the chamber deep and commanding, as though the walls themselves carried his words. Who dares say this man is unworthy? The question hit harder than any objection, sharper than any argument. It wasn't addressed to Marcus or even to the court. It was a challenge hurled at the very heart of the accusation. Whittaker's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. Neither did Brooks. General Stanton turned slowly, his eyes locking on the judge, unwavering. If it weren't for Marcus Hill, he said, his voice steady, I would be a name carved on a gravestone instead of standing here today. The revelation struck like lightning. Gasps rippled through the room. Someone dropped their notebook. Cameras clicked furiously as reporters scrambled to capture the moment. The whispers that had haunted the edges of the trial, the rumors of a powerful ally, the unconfirmed stories suddenly came roaring to life. No longer rumor, but fact. I saw Whittaker's grip on the gavel falter, his hand trembling ever so slightly. For the first time, his authority seemed fragile, threatened not by law, but by truth. Brooks opened her mouth as if to speak, but the words never came. Whatever protest she had planned evaporated under Stanton's gaze. And in that silence, the twist revealed itself, not with theatrics, not with overstatement, but with the undeniable weight of lived reality. The letter Marcus had read just moments earlier wasn't just a story of sacrifice. It was the prelude to this moment, the thread that connected the fallen with the living, the battlefield with this courtroom. Stanton's presence was proof not on paper, not in rhetoric, but in flesh and blood. Proof that Marcus's courage had saved not only comrades in the trenches, but a man whose very title carried power enough to shake the foundation of that courtroom. The room felt colder, sharper. I could see jurors shifting uncomfortably, as if the very ground beneath them had shifted. The spectators leaned forward, some with tears brimming, others with awe written across their faces. Whitaker finally lowered the gavel, but the sound of it never came. His hand hung in the air, suspended in hesitation. His eyes flickered, uncertain, perhaps even fearful. General Stanton didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The authority of his presence made every word thunder. This man fought for this country. He fought for you. He fought for me. And if you call him unworthy, then you insult every man who ever wore this uniform, every woman who ever saluted the flag, every life lost in the dirt of a foreign land. No one dared move. Marcus, still holding the worn letter in one hand and the medal in the other, simply bowed his head. Not in defeat, not in shame, but in the quiet dignity of a man who never asked for someone else to fight his battles, yet now found one of the nation's most powerful warriors standing in his corner. Outside the courthouse, the crowd, which had been restless and loud, seemed to sense the shift inside. The chants turned into cheers. The sound rolled like a wave, growing louder, stronger, until the very glass panes of the courtroom trembled. Whitaker's lips parted, but no ruling came. For the first time in the entire trial, the man who had commanded silence with a single strike of wood found himself drowned in a silence, not of respect, but of reckoning. The twist had been revealed. The truth was standing in uniform, undeniable and immovable. And from that moment on, nothing in that courtroom would ever be the same. General Stanton stepped closer to the stand, his medals catching the light with every breath he took. His voice was steady, but his eyes carried the weight of old battles. I remember that day like it was yesterday. He began, silence falling so deep, the hum of the ceiling fan seemed loud. Smoke thick as night, men screaming for their lives. I was pinned under a collapsed wall, my leg crushed. I couldn't move, and I knew I was done. He paused, lifting his chin toward Marcus. Until this man, Marcus Hill, came charging through gunfire. He tore through the rubble, pulled me out, and dragged me across open ground while bullets cut the dirt around us. If it weren't for him, I'd be buried overseas instead of standing here today. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Stanton's voice faltered for the first time. He removed his cap, his tone breaking. Many of my men never came home. I carry their names with me every day. But I lived because of him. And I will never let anyone say Marcus Hill is unworthy of honor. Then, with deliberate grace, Stanton faced Marcus. The decorated general, 4 stars on his shoulders, a lifetime of service etched in his frame, bowed his head. The sight stunned the room. A hush spread, broken by a single clap, then another. Within seconds, the courtroom rose. Men and women wiped their eyes, their applause swelling into a thunder that shook the walls. Some veterans in the gallery snapped to attention and gave a sharp salute, tears streaming unchecked. But amid the roar, Judge Whitaker's face tightened, and from the prosecution's table, District Attorney Brooks lurched up, his voice cracking with desperation. Your Honor, with respect, this display doesn't erase the charges. hero or not, the law demands a verdict. We cannot let sentiment blind us. His words cut through the noise like broken glass, but the crowd only grew louder. Stanton turned fire in his chest, and his words boomed across the chamber. The only blindness here, counselor, is yours. The only crime in this room is daring to call a soldier's sacrifice a burden. Brooks shrank back his argument, dying under the weight of Stanton's glare. Outside, news crews caught the flood of emotion. Reporters whispered, but were drowned out by the sound of veterans lining the steps, standing shoulder to shoulder, raising their hands in salute to Marcus Hill. A chant began low at first, then swelling justice for Hill. Justice for Hill. Inside, the applause refused to stop. It rolled over Whitaker like a tide he couldn't control. His gavel slammed once, then again, but the people's voices carried higher, demanding to be heard. And in that chaos between the gavel and the roar, the future of Marcus Hill hung in the balance. The chamber was still shaking from Stanton's words. When Judge Whitaker finally leaned forward, his gavel trembling in his hand, his lips pressed into a thin white line. For a moment, he looked as though he might fight. The tide might cling to authority like a man clutching driftwood in a storm. But then he saw it. The veterans saluting, the families weeping, the general himself bowing before a black soldier who had given everything for his country. And Whitaker knew whatever order he had given before, it could not stand in the face of this truth. With a stiff breath, he set the gavel down. This court withdraws its previous command, he muttered the words tasting like ash. It was the closest thing to surrender he had ever spoken. The noise outside pressed against the walls like thunder. Cameras flashed through the courthouse windows, and in that fragile quiet, Marcus reached for the medal still resting in Stanton's hands. He held it for a moment, as if weighing all the lives it represented, all the nights he had carried their memory alone. Then, with hands that did not shake, Marcus pinned it back onto his own chest. His voice was low almost to himself, but clear enough that the front rows heard it. At last. They've heard us. The words weren't about himself alone. They were for every soldier left behind, every name carved into stone, every promise that sacrifice would not be forgotten. General Stanton turned his eyes sweeping across the benches and spoke again, this time with the weight of final judgment. Honor does not sit on a bench. It does not wear robes or write decrees. Honor lives in the hearts of those who give, and in the voices of those who refuse to be silent. And today, honor belongs to Marcus Hill. The gallery broke open. Applause rose like a storm, tears flowing freely down the faces of men and women who had carried quiet scars for years. Even those who had never served stood unable to hold back their emotions. It was not just a soldier being vindicated, it was the very idea of dignity reclaimed before their eyes. Whitaker's gavel pounded, but this time it was meaningless. The people had taken the floor, and no ruling could silence what they had seen. When the session adjourned, the courthouse steps became a sea of cameras and microphones. Reporters shouted questions, their voices swallowed by the roar of the crowd. The chant still echoed, "Justice for Hill, justice for Hill." And then, through the blur of flashing bulbs, a small voice cut through it all. "Dad!" A boy broke through the crowd, no older than 12, his school bag still slung over his shoulder. He threw his arms around Marcus's waist, burying his face against the uniform that smelled of sweat and history. "I'm proud of you," the boy whispered, his words trembling, but sure. Marcus froze, overwhelmed, then pulled his son in tighter, pressing his forehead against the boy's hair. For all the cheers, All the noise. This was the sound that mattered. The only verdict he ever needed. The cameras clicked furiously, capturing the embrace. By nightfall, the photograph was everywhere on television screens, front pages, phones passed hand to hand. A black soldier, once accused and humiliated, standing tall as his son clung to him. No caption could contain what it meant, but everyone understood. It was more than news. It was a symbol, a reminder that justice is not confined to a courtroom's verdict, nor measured by the cold letter of the law. Justice is also the honor we grant to sacrifice, the dignity we return to those who have carried our burdens, the respect we owe not because the law demands it, but because our humanity does. And in that moment, under the blinding lights, with tears and applause echoing into the night, America was forced to remember. Justice is not just a ruling. Justice is respect. Justice is honor. Justice is Marcus Hill. And that, my friends, is the heart of this story: justice, honor, and the power of dignity. Marcus's journey reminds us all that true respect isn't handed down from a bench. It's earned through sacrifice, courage, and love. If this story moved you, I'd love for you to pass it on. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it today, and make sure you subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories so you won't miss the next powerful chapter. Your support means the world to us. Every comment, every share, every new subscriber gives our team the strength to keep bringing you stories that matter. Stories that shine a light on justice, compassion, and the fight for human dignity. Here at Mr. Mac's Stories, we believe in leaving more than just entertainment behind. We believe in leaving a mark, a reminder that truth and honor always rise. That's our symbol, and with your support, we'll carry it forward together.